Welcome to Toronto Center's webcast on climate change, the challenge for institutional investors and regulators. Toronto Center for Global Leadership in Financial Supervision was established in 1998 as a non-profit organization to promote sound financial governance and stability and financial inclusion. Since inception, we have trained more than 10,000 supervisors and regulators in 190 countries and territories in all sectors of financial services. Today, I will interview our special guest, Hugh O'Reilly, President and CEO of OP Trust, one of Canada's largest pension funds with more than $19 billion in assets under management and with offices in London, Sydney, and Toronto. Hugh is playing a leadership role in advancing the ability of all asset owners to understand the risks they face from climate change. Also joining us is Elena Singer, Chair of Toronto Center's Securities Advisory Board. She's a senior securities lawyer with extensive regulatory experience, including at the Ontario Securities Commission. She's the Vice President and Corporate Secretary of the Canadian Investment Protection Fund. We very much appreciate the valuable contributions of Elena and the Securities Advisory Board to this important webcast. Climate change and financial stability are two critical public policy preoccupations. They are reflected in the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and Canadian government's Feminist International Assistance Policy. Countries are increasingly aware that their financial systems can and must play a pivotal role in combating climate change, and that their financial systems must be made resilient against the effects of climate change on our economies. In turn, financial sector supervisors are becoming increasingly aware of the need to incorporate climate risk in their work. As Mark Carney, Chair of the Financial Stability Board, has noted, the climate change phenomena poses substantial risks for whole swaths of financial systems. Climate change will increase insurance liabilities due to the physical risks as well as the consequences for businesses that may suffer due to extreme weather effects. There will be liability risks if those who have suffered loss related to climate change seek damage from those they hold responsible. There will be transition risks related to the process of adjustment toward a lower carbon economy, such as new risks associated with green bonds and the inclusion of environmental and sustainability criteria in credit risk management. Toronto Centre addresses climate risk in some of our insurance programs, and we held a special cross-sectoral executive panel on climate change and financial stability at the 2016 spring meetings of the IMF World Bank in Washington. We are now developing programming that examines climate risk in financial regulatory and supervisory agencies in our securities and other programs. I would like to thank Toronto Center's key sponsors, Global Affairs Canada, the Swedish International Development Agency, and the International Monetary Fund. I also would like to acknowledge two of our founders, the Schulich School of Business and the World Bank. We hope you will enjoy the interview. Thank you very much for hosting us in your beautiful office. What do you view as the principal risks relating to climate change that pension funds and institutional investors face?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Really, it's an honor for me to be interviewed and to have the opportunity to speak about the issue of climate change. We view climate change as a significant risk. It's a risk that at the moment is hard to put your arms around as an investor, and that's for a variety of reasons. First of all, we're long-term investors, so the investments we make are for periods of 50, potentially 100 years, because that's the length of our liabilities. What happens in the climate is going to have a direct material effect on our assets. For example, a lot of people focus on oil and gas. We don't believe in divestment. We believe in better practices, using the power of our capital to achieve better practices. We also think that no matter where we invest, we want better disclosure. For example, one might think that if you invest in real estate, that you don't have to worry about climate, but depending on where the real estate is located, you may well have to worry about it if it's in a coastal area. So from our point of view, climate change is a risk. It's a risk we need to better understand so we can value it, we can assess it, and we can make the right decisions in our members' long-term interests.
OP Trust has been a leader in proposing action on climate change. In fact, in January of this year, you published a paper. Can you provide us with some background about why you as CEO believe that this is an important area for OP Trust?
Well, we think it's an important issue there's a variety of reasons. OP Trust views itself, we call ourselves a pension citizen. What that means is it has several facets to it. One facet is we want to make sure that not just our members, but everyone in Canada has a secure retirement income. Second, we think it's important to make the world, I appreciate this may sound like a cliche, but we think that there's an alignment in interest between doing the right thing on climate and our members' long-term interest. We got active on the climate file because, like other plans in other jurisdictions, we wanted to produce a carbon footprint. But what we discovered was with the lack of proper information, lack of disclosure by issuers, we couldn't actually put together a carbon footprint that would have any meaning or resonance or that we could act upon. For that reason, we participated in the Bloomberg process. We looked at their initial recommendations. We retained Mercer to do a study. Mercer ran 4 separate climate scenarios based on our portfolio. And what the scenarios really demonstrate is that there is a lack of information. The lack of information means you can't make really good judgments. And so what we've done is the first stage of our process is where we want to see better disclosure, more meaningful disclosure, so we can make better investment decisions by taking account of climate as a risk.
Thank you. And I think, Elena, you have a question.
Thank you, Babak, and thank you, Hugh. How does OP Trust view the concept of responsible investment, and how do you incorporate that into your strategy under your leadership?
Even before I got here, OP Trust was a leader in responsible investing. Our director of responsible investing, Catherine Preston, is one of the leading thinkers in this area. I often joke she does all the work, I take all the credit, but she generally laughs at that joke. And we've also done work in the alternative investment space. Jordan Berger led that effort, so we were a leader there. But for us, what responsible investing is fundamentally, in almost every case, is about engaging. So we don't believe, as an almost general rule, we don't believe in divestment. We think that we have an obligation to push issuers to do a better job, to push issuers to act in the long-term interest, whether it's from an environmental perspective, a social perspective, or a governance perspective. And we do that not because we do it in part, I suppose, because it's the right thing, but we also do it because we think those companies perform better. If you look at environmental issues, when I started my legal career 25 years ago, the idea of environmental law was considered something like only hippies and granola eaters did. Now every major Bay Street law firm has an environmental group. You would not buy an asset if you knew it had an environmental issue. It's part of the due diligence process. Similarly, we look at RI from that perspective. It affects how we make our decisions. It affects how we value an asset. And we also believe, and there is data to support this, companies that are well governed, that are environmentally responsible, and are socially responsible in the long term perform better.
Hugh, Toronto Centre has an international audience, many of whom are in developing countries and emerging markets. You have investments around the world and are aware of the various global trends. Do you have any views on climate change and finance as an issue of concern for developing countries?
we have investments in the developing and emerging markets. Second, when you look at an issue like climate change, I think that when you see a lot of manufacturing taking place in the developing and emerging world, we have to understand that we're in a sense exporting our climate issues and our environmental issues to those countries, so we need to be mindful of it from that perspective. We're also active in the international community. We will be issuing on November 22nd a report that we commissioned with the World Bank and 3 other Canadian pension plans. And what that document does is it discusses the Canadian model of pension plans, really the Canadian models of pension plans. And what we're wanting to do is work with the World Bank, work with countries in the emerging and developing worlds to help them, in a spirit of partnership, to help them create a pension plan that's or a social security system that's in the image of the Canadian system. We'd be very interested in training the people in those countries around our practices, our best practices, in a spirit of humility. Canadian pension funds come out of a lot of mistakes. That's why we got to where we are. We're also interested in learning about practices in the developing and emerging world. I think what's going on there from a fintech perspective is going to have application here. And then we also think by helping to develop a plan in the Canadian model, it will first of all enhance local investment beyond just the fixed income market. And second, we think, based on conversations we've undertaken and analytics we've undertaken, one of the big hurdles to investing in the emerging and developing world is the lack of a trusted partner. And if we help create plans in those countries in partnership, that'll act as a magnet for foreign investment. So that will yield a whole bunch of results. It'll yield better skills in those countries, better skills in understanding for us. It'll yield a solid social security system, but it'll also create investment opportunities and outputs, which we think will be positive. So we have a big interest in the emerging and developing world. That's where the future of the world literally and figuratively actually is, and we want to be part of it.
Elena, I have a question for you. How important is this issue for regulators and supervisors, and should they really care?
Thank you, Babak. That's a great question. Climate change is really a significant area of focus for regulators and supervisors in the securities area. Regulators play a key role in shaping market behavior and really are there to ensure that investors, both institutional and retail, have all of the information that they need and the disclosure relating to climate change risks and opportunities before an investment decision is made. For example, there is a need for an assessment and valuation and pricing of climate-related risks and opportunities. Regulators and markets want to avoid inaccurate pricing or valuation of assets, which really can lead to a misallocation of capital. Ultimately, regulators, supervisors, policymakers, boards, institutional investors like OP Trust all have a critical role to play in driving this conversation forward. And I believe that a proactive regulatory approach is essential.
I think securities regulators have an important role to play. First and foremost, I think they need to lead a conversation on this. And I think there are examples where they've done this in other areas, for example, gender diversity. I think by leading a conversation between investors and issuers, that's useful, that's helpful, that moves the discussion forward. Second, securities regulation is fundamental to having confidence in our capital markets, but sometimes securities rules tend to be a little bit black and white. You're either complying or you're not. And I think a concern that issuers likely have is this, that if they posit climate-related scenarios or risks and they're not certain if they're correct or if they're not certain how it'll turn out, that they may be held accountable for those kind of disclosures. I think the securities regulators need to give some thought to allowing issuers to grant some flexibility if they make disclosures, if they provide scenario analysis, that it's not necessarily black and white. In fact, it may not necessarily at the end of the day end up being right or wrong, if you will, because we just don't know. We're into unknown and uncharted areas, but I think we need a little bit of flexibility on the part of regulatory authorities to allow issuers to begin this kind of disclosure. Because I can tell you, we as an investor We have endorsed the Bloomberg Task Force recommendations. We are going to act on them. We are going to hold the entities that we invest in accountable around them, and getting proper disclosure will assist in that. So I think that's a convening role that our securities regulators could play.
And do you find them to be responsive to some of these ideas?
I do. I think there's a genuine interest on the part. I'm most familiar with the Ontario Securities Commission, but I've been involved in at least two panels directly where there have been securities OSC representation. I know they're interested in this area. I haven't talked to them about relaxing rules or anything like that, and I wouldn't presume to speak for them, but I think this is an area where they could be creative, could be helpful, and moving the conversation forward really matters, because here's my fundamental issue when it comes to climate change. We've been talking about this for a quarter of a century, probably longer than Elena has been on the planet. And notwithstanding all this talk, there's been very little action. And it's kind of surprising that it's 2017, there's been 3 or 4 major international agreements, and we still don't even have agreed upon standards of disclosure and how we value this risk. Given that, and given that we're at such an embryonic stage, I think the securities regulators could play a very important role to create the conditions for this conversation to go forward.
Thank you. And unlike you, I have witnessed a couple of quarter centuries, so I think I'll give the chance for you to ask the next question.
Sure, and actually, well, I'm close to witnessing half a century, so there we go. But just on that point, a bit off script, but I'd just like to follow up on that question regarding
He told me I could go off script.
Yes,
excellent. Okay, makes it more
course you can.
interesting, more interactive. Question about regulators. Can regulators, in terms of driving the conversation forward and being able to relax the rules a little, it sounds like, from your perspective, a more principles-based approach rather than a prescriptive rules-based approach on this would be preferable. What guidance would you give to regulators on this front? I know there are often some pushback from market participants with respect to principles-based approaches, because it's not kind of a tick-the-box type of situation. So is there some other area where regulators could draw from, where there has been more of a success in terms of principles-based approach in a new area like this one?
Well, I'm a big proponent of principles-based regulation. I think in some areas, for example, energy regulation, we've seen there are examples of principles as opposed to being prescriptive and rules-based. So that's one example that comes to mind off the top. I think to a degree we see principles-based regulation in the pension space, where I'd like to see more of it. But overall, I think this is an area where we can pioneer. I think it's an area where Canadian regulators in particular, when you look at the focus on, in our capital markets, on resource extraction, this is an area we can really make a difference. And I think as long as everyone's clear on what the rules are, so the issuers' disclosure statements would make clear that these are not set rules or set outcomes because of the level of uncertainty, where the OSC and other regulators could make that clear as well, then there won't be a misunderstanding. Because one thing's for sure, and the scenario analysis that Mercer did for us demonstrated is the disclosure is going to be wrong.
Right.
But absent the disclosure, absent starting this process, because it is a process, absent starting it, we're never going to get anywhere.
I have one off-script question, and I'll pass on to you.
Sure.
Disclosure is a very interesting topic, and it's I'm sure as you found through the work that you did, standards vary, and there's very different ways of doing it. Is a disclosure really true disclosure, or is it projection of the various data? How does that work? And as an institutional investor, pension funds overseer, how much of a confidence do you have in the disclosures that you see across the board?
Well, I guess there's two levels to your question. I mean, we have confidence in the disclosure we receive from the companies we invest in. We think the securities rules do a good job on that and help to enhance confidence in the capital markets. But the interesting part about the interesting second level to your question is, we're talking about something quite different here. I mean, we might be used to seeing issuers do projections around how long a particular resource is going to last or how long a certain capital equipment is going to last. This is very different because there's a high degree of speculation. And then the other thing I think we need to start to see some disclosure around, which I think would be promoted by this sort of thing, is I also want to know what issuers are doing in terms of adapting. If climate change is going to occur, and you have real estate in a coastal area, are they doing things to guard against that? Now, this may all sound impossible and difficult, but I think if you look at the property and casualty insurers, they have to underwrite climate risk. They are doing interesting things. I think there are lessons to be learned there. And I think we can gain a better understanding if we learn some of those lessons and apply them more generally. But again, what you'll hear from issuers is, geez, we don't want to speculate on stuff and we don't know, and that makes it really hard from a securities law point of view. And I agree. So that's why I think we need some creativity on the part of regulators to allow these conversations to go forward.
Can you describe some of the key findings from the report that OP Trust, under your leadership, published in January of this year?
Well, the key finding is there's a lack of disclosure, and it's very difficult for us to engage as a responsible investor. Because of that, we're now doing a second phase of the climate work, and we'll be releasing a further report probably by the end of the year. But what we're trying to do internally is to create a common view around climate risk. Because our investors, we have great investors, private, public markets, they do a good job, but they're used to doing things a certain way, so we're challenging them. We're saying, are you looking at this issue? And some of them, and I'm glad they're saying this, they're saying, not really, or we don't know what it means. And the reason why I'm glad they're saying that is, I don't want people just spouting what they think is the company line here. If we're going to move the ball forward from the point of view of what we do, how we do things, who we are, and the contribution we make on behalf of our members, I need that kind of level of honesty, skepticism. So we've had good conversations that way. We also think the other lesson we learned from it is there's a plethora, there's a number of groups that are doing work on this, a number of different task force, climate disclosure project. They're all good organizations. We belong, I think, to virtually every one of them, and it all makes sense. But we think we don't want plurality of views there. So we have made a strategic decision that we're endorsing the recommendations of the task force on climate disclosure, and we're going to act on those. We will produce our, we don't have an annual report, we call it a funded status report that we issue every year. It's going to attempt to implement the recommendations from the climate disclosure task force. So we're going to do that. We're going to have meaningful conversations internally, and we're going to make climate analysis, adaptation, risk part of our conversation. We're involved in I'll give you a concrete example of something that's just unfolded. It's a real credit because we're working hard to make our RI just organically part of our process. It's a real credit to the work that Catherine has done over the years here. So we're engaged now in an exercise where we're going to be investing in building a pipeline, but they actually did a climate analysis, and they compared what's the carbon produced by trucking the oil to a transportation site to the pipeline. That's pretty amazing.
Wow.
And it's just the beginning, but because we just don't say here's the way it is, because we encourage or try to create an idea-rich environment where there's plenty of controversy, respectful, constructive dissent, if you will, I think we're going to come to the right outcome. The work we're doing right now with Ernst & Young on this has cataloged all of this. I was delighted that there was a range of views on this and people asking, how are we going to do this? And now we're going to try and make it more concrete.
Thank you. And it sounds like, I recall, Hugh, that you've also said, and this was confirmed in what you just stated now with respect to plurality of views and sort of the guidance that the FSB task force put out. Is it also your view that standardization and collaboration are sort of some of the key points in moving this forward?
Once we get a disclosure standard, then I think we can move together to get the right outcomes. And you know, and this may sound like, wow, this is really far out, it's a bit it's a bit crazy. Well, you know, we have GAP, generally accepted accounting principles. There was a time when we didn't. We have international and Canadian accounting standards. These things can be achieved, but we have to start somewhere. And unlike accounting standards, it's not quite as black and white. We need to do it. And we need to do it for a whole bunch of reasons, because we will have well-meaning people saying we should divest. But divestment isn't going to solve our issue in this case. It's about engaging with fossil fuel companies and the rest of it and moving it forward.
Thank you. You already mentioned some of your work on the international front with respect to developing jurisdictions and working in partnership, as well as the work that you are going to be publishing in partnership with the World Bank and other Canadian leading pension funds. Do you have any other remarks that you'd like to sort of talk about with respect to how Canada compares internationally and other conversations that you may have been having with leading pension funds around the globe?
Well, we participate in a number of international pension organizations. I think Canada has an excellent pension system. I think our public system is enviable, but I think we have to be careful, because sometimes I think Canadians are the smuggest people in the world. I'm a proud Canadian, but we act like these things they're part of our birthright and we were born to it. Reality is we made a bunch of mistakes in the public pension sector. We've taken steps to fix them, and those lessons, both in terms of failure and how we reacted to failure, and the political courage and the courage of our members and sponsors, that's also got to be part of our message. I think Canadians also, pension funds, I know at OP Trust, our fundamental focus is the long-term interest of our members. It's maintaining our funded position so that we provide the current benefits at the current price. That's what our members want us to fundamentally do. We're in the business of retirement income security, and they want to make sure we're doing that in a way that makes sense for them. So we do that work as well. I think in the responsible investing front, Canadian plans do great work on this. There's recent survey done by Tufts. Their methodology was flawed because they didn't include us, but leaving that small point aside, Canadian plans are amongst the leaders in the world on this, and I think we have to continue to talk to other jurisdictions about what we're doing, but we have to be very conscious to do it in a sense of humility, to do it in a sense of partnership, and not telling people that, you know, we're so awesome and it's unbelievable.
Thank you.
Elena, building on something that Hugh talked about with respect to the property and casualty, insurance supervisors and regulators for some time have been factoring the risk of climate change. As the chair of Toronto Centre Securities Advisory Board, do you think that climate risk discussions should be integrated into Toronto Centre's training programs? And do you have any ideas?
Thank you, Babak. I think that's a great question, and certainly as chair of the Securities Advisory Board, and as we've been discussing today, this is a critical issue for securities regulators to be discussing, and therefore, as you know, I've been recommending that this topic be included as part of a larger governance discussion in our international securities programs, as well as future programs that take place that are country specific or topic specific. One specific example would be our July International Flagship Securities Program, where we are planning to incorporate a panel discussion and possibly a case study on climate change, either incorporating it as part of a larger governance discussion or as a standalone. And I think that will be a really worthwhile way to move this discussion forward with respect to securities regulators from around the world coming together and discussing the topic. I also recognize that there has been a lot of movement, and that TC, the Toronto Centre, has been leading the charge on this with respect to, for example, the executive panel on climate change that took place in the context of the World Bank IMF annual meetings in 2016, as well as a guidance note that was issued subsequently.
Great. Well, I think that of course it would be fantastic, because I know that we put a lot of time and energy into these international programs. Thank you, Elena. Hugh, sadly, we're coming to the end of the program, and I found this discussion very stimulating and thought-provoking. Do you have any final comments for us as we're about to close this program?
Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity, and those are kind words, but I guess what I want to fundamentally thank you for is, I think by engaging in this conversation, I think you're setting a tone. I think it'll be useful to the investor community, to issuers, and to regulators, and it'll create the environment that provides the certainty and safety for people to have these conversations. So I'm just grateful for you giving us the opportunity, and I'm glad you've created this forum.
Thank you. And Elena, I'm going to ask you to basically close the program for us with your any final thoughts that you might have for us. And also want to thank you very much for inspiring us to do this, initially contacting Hugh. I think this was a very worthwhile initiative. And thanks to the leadership that you're having with our Securities Advisory Board.
Well, thank you, Babak. This has been a pleasure. And Hugh, I want to thank you for your valuable insights and for your candor, and indeed for, as Babak mentioned, for your leadership on this very worthwhile and important, relevant, timely topic. I'm looking forward to continuing to work in this area. I do believe that it's an important and significant public policy consideration for regulators, for boards, for institutional investors, and for the Toronto Centre, as we've discussed today. And so, as we mentioned, Toronto Centre will be incorporating this into future programming on the securities and other fronts, and I'm looking forward to that. Now, in terms of other areas that I would like to touch on, I want to thank Babak and his very talented team, some of whom are here today. Thank you for all of your help in putting this together. I know it has been no small feat. I also want to thank the Securities Advisory Board members who have been extraordinarily supportive on this front and continue to think that it's an important issue and that we should, as the Toronto Centre, provide guidance and leadership on this. And finally, I would like to thank all of you, the audience, for being here and watching us today. We look forward to continuing to drive this conversation forward. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.